Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So, I want you to imagine being like the wealthiest, most influential person in your entire hemisphere.
Right, and we're not just talking about having a lot of money. You possess the kind of generational power that, actually shapes empires.
Exactly. You wake up surrounded by advisors who basically hang on your every syllable. Your family is universally celebrated, and by every metric society has ever devised, you have completely won the game of life.
Yeah, you've peaked. And then I want you to imagine waking up the very next day in a freezing damp cell. The wealth has been completely seized. The titles are gone.
It's just staggering. You are totally isolated from everyone you love, basically just listening for the footsteps of the executioner. I mean, how do you not completely lose your mind?
Well, that's exactly what we are dissecting today. We're looking at what is essentially the ultimate survival guide for the human ego.
Yeah, we are stepping into the mind of a real historical figure who experienced this exact staggering plunge from the absolute pinnacle of society to rock bottom.
And from his prison cell, he wrote a text that would echo through millennia. Today, we're doing a deep dive into Book 2 of the Consolation of Philosophy.
Right. We're going to sit with the author as he is visited by the personification of philosophy, who arrives not to coddle him, but to violently wake him up. Our mission today is to extract the core wisdom from this dialogue and see how these radical ancient ideas about happiness, wealth, and the randomness of luck can completely rewire the psychological architecture of your life today.
And the stakes of this text are, they're what make it so piercing. We aren't dealing with abstract theories debated in a comfortable symposium.
No, not at all.
We are dealing with psychological triage in the face of absolute ruin. When philosophy appears to the author in his cell, and she's described as this majestic, almost unearthly woman, she steps in as a physician treating a critical trauma patient.
Yeah, and her initial diagnosis is incredibly confrontational, right?
Oh, totally. She tells him he is sick, but the pathology of his sickness isn't his imprisonment. The sickness is his lingering addiction to his former good fortune.
Which is such a wild way to look at it. She frames good fortune not as, a lost friend, but as a siren with manifold wiles.
Right. She is describing a predatory creature who seduces, caresses, and then deliberately abandons her victims, leaving them just drowning in insupportable grief.
The word siren carries so much weight there. It completely shifts the perspective. It's not just that he lost something valuable, it's that he was targeted, seduced, and betrayed.
Exactly. It implies that the good times were a trap from the very beginning.
But philosophy doesn't let him wallow in that feeling of victimization. She introduces a metaphor that has permeated our culture ever since, which is the Wheel of Fortune.
Right. The text describes how mad fortune sweeps along in wanton pride, trampling mighty kings into the dust one moment and lifting the conquered into the victor's seat the next.
Think about the physical mechanics of a wheel. If you attach yourself to the outer rim of a turning wheel, your elevation is entirely dependent on the wheel's rotation.
Yeah, and philosophy's point is that this sudden drop isn't some glitch in the universe, This is the operating system itself. She points out that mutability change itself is fortune's only constant rule.
It's her defining feature.
Right. She says, if it takes to standing still, it ceases to be the wheel of fortune. The author is devastated because his luck changed, but philosophy is aggressively challenging his outrage. She is essentially asking him why he expects a spinning wheel to freeze in place just because he happened to like the view from the top.
You're hitting on the exact cognitive dissonance we all experience today. We interact with modern systems that are entirely out of our control. Think about the stock market, real estate cycles, or even something as ubiquitous as a social media algorithm.
Oh, for sure. The algorithm is a perfect modern parallel.
Right? You might run a business that suddenly thrives because the algorithm inexplicably favors your content. You feel like a genius. You feel like you've completely earned that traffic and that income.
Yeah, and then overnight, the code changes, your visibility drops to 0, and you are absolutely furious.
You feel robbed. But philosophy is telling us across the centuries, you committed your sails to the winds. You don't get to choose where the wind blows.
Exactly.
You wouldn't walk outside and scream at the sky for a change in the weather, so why are you screaming at luck for changing? You voluntarily chose to play a game governed by chance, and now you're enraged that chance behaved like chance.
And that cognitive dissonance is precisely what philosophy puts on trial. She actually takes it a step further by staging a brilliant courtroom defense, but she does it by speaking as Fortune herself.
Oh, I love this part.
Yeah, Fortune takes the stand to defend herself against the author's complaints, and she asks him a very simple, piercing question. She asks, "What goods of thine have I taken from thee?"
The brutal logic of that question just stops you in your tracks. Fortune argues that every single human comes into the world naked and destitute. We arrive with nothing.
Nothing.
Therefore, everything you acquire, the money, the status, the power, the relationships, is essentially a lease from her. You don't own it, you were just renting it from the universe.
She reminds him, "I cherished thee with my substance. I surrounded thee with a royal abundance." And because it was always her substance to begin with, she has the absolute unassailable right to draw back her hand.
Right, she basically says, am I alone to be forbidden to do what I will with my own?
Yes, and she points to the natural world as her precedent. The skies bring bright, sunlit days, but they also bring dark, freezing nights. The seasons offer spring flowers, but they also mandate winter storms.
The sea is glassy and calm one day and violently destructive the next.
Exactly. Fortune is simply doing her job within the ecosystem of human experience. If you mount the wheel, you agree to the rules of the game.
We have this innate, almost childish belief that if we hold on to something long enough, it legally becomes ours. But you cannot be mad about losing things that were never truly yours in the first place.
It's a hard pill to swallow, though.
Oh, totally. Because even understanding that logic, the pain of the loss is staggering. If Fortune is just doing her job, why does losing our position on the wheel hurt so deeply, like on a physiological level?
To really grasp that, we have to look at the specific human being at the center of this dialogue and the sheer dizzying height from which he fell.
Right, because we aren't just talking about a person who faced a mild career setback.
No, not at all. With this incredible inventory of his blessings, and philosophy brings them up not to mock him, but to force perspective. He had a life most people couldn't even conceptualize.
Yeah, though orphaned young, he was taken in and raised by the most illustrious men of his era. He married a woman renowned for her peerless virtue and had a brilliant, universally respected father-in-law, Symmachus.
But the absolute pinnacle, the moment philosophy highlights to show the zenith of his fortune, is when he watched his two sons ride out from their home as joint consuls.
For our listeners, being a joint consul in this era was essentially holding the highest elected office possible. It was the apex of political and social achievement.
And he got to see both of his sons achieve it simultaneously. They were followed by a massive train of senators, welcomed by cheering throngs. He sat in the Senate House, delivered a panegyric, which is a massive public speech of praise to the king, earning legendary fame for his eloquence.
Just living the absolute dream.
Totally. Afterward, he sat in the circus between his two consul sons, distributing triumphal largesses to the multitudes. Philosophy reminds him, "Thou didst cozen fortune, thou didst bear off a boon which she had never before granted to any private person." He didn't just succeed, he broke the historical record for human prosperity.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, because frankly, this is where the author raises an incredibly difficult counterargument, and it's one that I think almost everyone listening has felt at some point.
Well,
After a devastating breakup, a sudden job loss, or the death of someone you love, the memories of the good times don't feel like a comfort, they feel like a weapon. The author says to philosophy, in adverse fortune, the worst sting of misery is to have been happy.
yeah, that line is just brutal.
It really is.
Yeah.
He is arguing that the memory of his past happiness is the very thing making his current suffering unbearable. It forces a really dark question, Isn't it better to have never had it at all than to have it, love it, and violently lose it?
The trauma of contrast is a very real psychological phenomenon. The brain registers the delta, the gap between what was and what is, and that gap is where the agony lives.
Yes, the deltas.
But philosophy refuses to let him use his memories as a torture device. She challenges his accounting. She basically tells him his ledger is mathematically incorrect. Even sitting in a cell facing execution, he retains what is objectively most precious.
Right. His father-in-law, Symmachus, is safe. His wife is alive, though grieving for him. His sons are safe and carrying on his legacy.
Philosophy points out that Fortune's hate has not swept away all his dear ones. The deepest anchors of his life are still holding firm in the storm.
She tells him to dry his tears because he still possesses things that are dearer to him than his own life. But she pairs that comfort with a fascinating, almost cynical reality check about the human condition itself, which is that no one has a perfect lot.
Right. She runs through this incredible taxonomy of human misery among the privileged. The way she deconstructs the illusion of the perfect life is just brilliant.
Yeah, tell us about those archetypes.
Well, she lists these archetypes of anxiety. One person has abundant, overflowing riches, but they are deeply ashamed of their ignoble birth and feel socially inferior. Another has unimpeachable nobility and bloodlines, but is crippled by poverty and wishes they could just be obscure.
Wow.
A third has both massive wealth and high nobility, but is intensely lonely because they remain unmarried. Another is happily married but childless, agonizing over the fact that they are nursing their wealth for a stranger to inherit.
And yet another has the spouse, the wealth, the nobility, and the children, but mourns the misdeeds of a terrible son or daughter.
Exactly. It's the ultimate destruction of the grass is greener myth. She says, so petty are the trifles which rob the most fortunate of perfect happiness.
The more favored a person is by fortune, the more fastidiously sensitive they become to the slightest discomfort. If you are entirely unschooled in adversity, the tiniest inconvenience feels like a catastrophe.
Oh, for sure. You see this today all the time.
Right. Someone flying first class has a meltdown because their champagne is slightly too warm, while someone else on the street is just hoping to find a meal. Philosophy is tearing down the deeply held illusion that there is some magical combination of external circumstances, like the right job, the right partner, the right bank balance, that equals permanent peace.
And if external circumstances can never provide permanent peace, what is their actual value? This realization is really the pivot point of the entire text.
It initiates a systematic, almost forensic teardown of the things society values most. Wealth, power, and fame. We need to translate this ancient teardown into our 21st century reality because the mechanics of human ambition haven't changed at all. Let's start with the illusion of wealth.
Right. Philosophy makes a radical argument about the fundamental nature of money. We view money as security, as a fortress to be hoarded. But philosophy argues that wealth is actually better in the spending than the hoarding. Avarice makes men hateful, while liberality brings renown.
The analogy she uses to prove the limitation of material wealth is mind-bending. She uses the physics of sound.
Yeah, the acoustic analogy is a masterpiece of ancient logic. She compares physical money to an audible voice. If you are in a massive room and someone speaks, that sound wave fills the entire space.
Right.
It can be heard and completely internalized by dozens, hundreds, or thousands of people at the exact same time as an unbroken whole. The sound isn't diminished because multiple people are experiencing it. The idea being communicated isn't cut into fractions.
But fiat currency, gold, physical wealth, it obeys a completely different set of physical laws.
Exactly. Material wealth is zero-sum. Money must be lessened to be shared. If you have a pile of gold, you cannot share it without breaking it into parts and decreasing your own share.
Right. If one person hoards all the wealth, they inherently and mathematically impoverish others. Because of this limitation, she calls material riches a poor and cramped thing. They cannot be possessed by one without robbing another.
Let's drag that into modern hyperconsumerism. We buy designer clothes, luxury cars, massive architectural homes, largely to signal our worth to the tribe. We use these zero-sum goods to establish status.
But philosophy cuts right through the vanity of that signaling. She talks about being decked in spring's flowers or shining in raiment of diverse colors. If it looked beautiful, she says, the praise belongs entirely to the maker of the clothes, or the material itself, not to you.
It's a devastating critique of how we outsource our self-worth, isn't it? If you are wearing a beautiful, expertly tailored Italian suit, the excellence belongs to the tailor and the sheep that provided the wool. You haven't magically become a better, more virtuous, or more beautiful human being. You are simply draped in someone else's skill.
You're trying to claim an alien excellence as your own internal trait.
Mm-hmm.
She confronts the reader directly, asking, have you no good of your own implanted within you, that you seek your good in things external and separate?
It's embarrassing when you frame it that way. We walk around acting like human mannequins, demanding respect for the fabric we didn't weave.
It really is. And the critique doesn't stop with money. The natural progression for human ambition, once it realizes money can't buy absolute security, is to seek power. If you can't buy safety, you force it by gaining control over others. But philosophy exposes power without virtue as an absolute catastrophe.
She points to the Emperor Nero as the ultimate case study in the failure of power. Nero was infamous for firing Rome, slaying senators, and murdering his own mother. He held absolute dominion from the east to the west. But she asks a critical question. Did this high absolute power impose any curb on his frenzied destructive will?
No.
No, it didn't. Power didn't make him a great man. It merely acted as a magnifying glass for his internal rot. It gave his madness a wider radius.
To really drive home how absurd our obsession with human power is, she introduces this hilarious, almost surreal analogy. She asks us to imagine a colony of mice.
Oh, the mouse analogy is fantastic.
Right. If one mouse stood up on its hind legs and claimed absolute lordship and divine right over all the other mice, we would laugh consumedly. We would find it to be the most ridiculous, pathetic display of ego imaginable.
Yet humans, who she reminds us, can be killed by something as trivial as the bite of a fly strut around claiming absolute power over one another.
The physical vulnerability of the human body is the great equalizer that mocks our power structures. An emperor and a peasant are equally susceptible to a creeping insect, a microscopic virus, or a sudden stroke.
Therefore, philosophy argues, what rights can one human realistically exercise over another except over their frail body and their external fortune? You cannot bind a free, reasoning spirit with a political mandate.
There's that incredible story she references about the tyrant trying to torture a free-born man into revealing a conspiracy. The tyrant thinks his physical power guarantees compliance. Instead, the prisoner bites off his own tongue and spits it in the tyrant's face.
Wow. Yeah, the tyrant thought he had absolute control, but the prisoner proved that a mind composed by reason is an untouchable fortress. Power is just an empty title if its jurisdiction ends at the physical shell.
Which leads us to the third external good, the final boss of human ego, which is fame. The argument she uses here is deeply rooted in the science of her time, yet the psychological mechanism is completely relevant today. She uses Ptolemy's astronomy to zoom out.
Oh, she zooms way, way out. We're talking cosmic perspective here.
Exactly. Think about the psychological impact of looking at that famous pale blue dot photograph from Voyager.
Yeah, she points out that the entire globe of the Earth, when compared to the vast, incomprehensible expanse of the heavens, is no bigger than a single mathematical point. It occupies essentially zero space.
And of that microscopic point, only about a fourth was known to be inhabited by living creatures in their era. Once you subtract the oceans, the unlivable marshes, and the deserts, the actual geographic area left for human habitation is terrifyingly narrow.
So you have all these humans prisoned in this merest fraction of a microscopic point in space, aggressively stressing out about spreading their renown and blazoning their fame.
It makes modern internet fame look like a psychiatric disorder. You go viral, you get 1 million followers, and your brain tricks you into thinking you are the center of the universe.
But even in the ancient world, fame had hard geographical limits. Philosophy points out that in Cicero's time, the towering fame of the Roman Republic hadn't even crossed the Caucasus Mountains. Fame is always constrained by geography.
It's constrained by geography. It's constrained by the fluid nature of cultural morals, like what is hailed as heroic in one nation is punishable by death in another. And above all, it is obliterated by time.
Yeah, she talks about how many people of high renown in their own era are completely lost to oblivion because there was no one to write their story or the books themselves just rotted away.
She calls it a second death. You die physically when your body gives out, and then you die a second time when the last person who remembers your name dies, or when the final record of your existence decays.
She asks us to compare the longest conceivable human legacy, say 10,000 years, to the infinite span of eternity. It's not just a short time, mathematically speaking. A finite number compared to infinity is 0. The greatest fame in human history is mathematically indistinguishable from 0.
The systematic nature of this argument is just breathtaking. She has meticulously stripped away every single external pillar a person might rely on for their sense of identity, security, or happiness.
Wealth is a mathematical burden that must be lost to be shared, and it only brings anxiety. Power is an absurd illusion of control over highly fragile bodies, mocked by the existence of a mosquito. Fame is a microscopic, temporary whisper in an infinite, uncaring universe.
Which leaves us staring into the abyss, If wealth, power, and fame are all empty, hollow pursuits, how are we supposed to structure our lives? We can't all just sit in a room and meditate on the meaninglessness of existence. How do we take this ancient teardown of our modern goals and use it to build a resilient psychological framework? We need actionable cognitive shifts.
Well, the text provides incredible blueprints for this. Let's look at a concept from Song 4. We can call it Finding your low rock.
Low rock, yeah.
The imagery is an architectural metaphor for the human psyche. It warns against building a dwelling your sense of self on a mountain peak, where it will be violently exposed to the fierce storm winds.
It also warns against building on shifting sands, which cannot sustain a burden when the waters rise. Instead, it advises fixing your resting place on some low rock's sure base.
To translate that into our daily lives, the mountain peak represents high status, extreme visibility, or public leadership. If you build your identity there, you are completely exposed to the elements of public opinion, cancel culture, and economic shifts.
And the shifting sands are the fleeting trends, right? The pursuit of whatever is socially rewarded today.
Exactly. If the core of who you are is built on either of those topographies, you will be destroyed when the storms of fortune inevitably arrive, because those environments are inherently unstable. The low rock represents foundational, unshakable values that do not rely on external validation.
The challenge for you as the listener is to do an audit of your foundational architecture. What is your low rock? What are the specific values in your life that remain entirely unaffected by public approval, a market crash, or how many likes a post gets?
Is it your personal integrity, your quiet dedication to your family, your private pursuit of knowledge or skill?
You have to identify that low rock and actively, consciously choose to anchor your sense of self-worth right there. Let the tempest roar overhead. Down on the low rock, you remain undisturbed.
That naturally flows into another vital cognitive shift drawn from Chapter 5, which is the audit of ownership. Philosophy asks a very direct Socratic question. She says, "Is there anything more precious to thee than thyself?"
And the obvious, instinctual answer is no, nothing.
Which springs the trap. Philosophy concludes, "If then thou art master of thyself, thou wilt possess that which thou wilt never be willing to lose, and which fortune cannot take from thee."
This is a psychological exercise you can do the moment this deep dive ends. Take a piece of paper and write down everything you value, everything you consider part of your wealth or identity. Your house, your car, your job title, your investment portfolio, your physical health, your social reputation.
Now look at that list and forcefully cross out anything that could theoretically be taken away by a market crash, a sudden illness, a natural disaster, or a vindictive boss. You have to be absolutely ruthless.
If you are honest, almost the entire page gets crossed out. But what remains? What is left standing after fortune has legally seized everything she is allowed to take?
Your character remains. Your capacity to reason remains. Your internal responses to adversity remain. That uncrossed list is your true sanctuary.
It forces the realization that self-mastery is the absolute only asset in the universe that is unstealable. When you realize that, the anxiety attached to the crossed-out items begins to dissipate.
And that dissipation of anxiety leads to a third framework, also from Chapter 5, the empty pockets mindset. We are conditioned to believe that abundance equals safety. But philosophy points out that material wealth actually robs a person of security.
She paints this vivid picture. A man who enters the road of life with empty pockets can sing a cheerful song right in the face of a highway robber. He has absolutely nothing to fear because he has nothing of material value to lose.
But the wealthy man traveling that same road is constantly dreading the pike and the sword. His abundance requires endless, exhausting accessories for its protection.
Think about the footprint of anxiety in your own life right now. Where is your abundance actually generating stress? We work tirelessly to buy a bigger house, and suddenly we are burdened with a massive mortgage, a more expensive security system, landscaping services, and higher insurance premiums.
We buy a luxury car, and we spend our time terrified of parking it at the grocery store in case someone dings the door. We accumulate so many accessories for protection that we become guards in our own museum.
The cognitive shift here is to consider simplifying the footprint of your anxiety by reducing the superfluity of vain display. Nature, as philosophy points out, is content with very little.
When we force excess upon her, it becomes harmful, even suffocating. Adopting an empty pockets mindset doesn't require you to take a vow of poverty or give away all your money. It requires detaching your sense of safety from those possessions.
It means operating in the world knowing that your true worth isn't in your pockets, allowing you to mentally walk down the dangerous road of life and sing in the robber's face.
But, and I think you might agree with me here, the logic is tight, but it's going to get some pushback.
Oh, I am going to push back hard here because in Chapter 8, philosophy drops an idea that I think most modern people will vehemently reject. She introduces the paradox of good versus ill fortune.
Right.
And she claims, and admits it's a strange thing to express, that ill fortune, meaning bad luck, suffering, and loss, is actually of more use to humans than good fortune. I'm sorry, but that sounds like toxic positivity to me.
It does sound like that at first.
That sounds like massive cope from a guy sitting in a cell trying to convince himself his ruined life is actually a hidden blessing. How is losing my job, crashing my car, or getting a terrible medical diagnosis a gift?
Your resistance is exactly how anyone would naturally react. It feels deeply counterintuitive, almost offensive. But you have to follow her logic regarding the nature of truth. She argues that good fortune is, by its very nature, a liar.
How so?
When she caresses you with success, wealth, and ease, she fundamentally deceives you into believing that fleeting things are permanent. She enchains your mind with the illusion of security.
So you're saying that when everything is going great, we're essentially living in a hallucination?
A comfortable hallucination, yes. But ill fortune, the crash, the sudden loss, the failure, is brutally truthful. By taking things away, she shows her true, inconstant nature. She shatters the hallucination.
That makes sense.
Good fortune makes you fickle, complacent, and self-deceived. Ill fortune makes you sober-minded, alert, and wary. Philosophy uses a violent metaphor. She says, ill fortune draws men back to the true good with grappling irons.
Wow.
A grappling iron tears into you, it hurts, but it is pulling you out of the wreckage. It is a painful rescue from illusion.
Okay, the grappling iron metaphor helps. It's an extraction. And she gives a very specific, painful example of this truthfulness in action, which is human relationships. When you are rich, successful, and riding high on the wheel, you are surrounded by people. You think you are deeply loved. But when good fortune leaves, she takes all of her friends with her. The only people left standing in the rubble with you are your friends.
She asks a penetrating question. What price would you not have gladly paid during your days of prosperity to know definitively, without a shadow of a doubt, who your true friends were? Well, ill fortune just gave you that priceless information for free. It's a harsh, unforgiving gift, but it is an invaluable one. It burns away the counterfeit.
It does burn it away, but the societal resistance to this idea is monolithic. I think it stems from what the text calls the wild lust of having in Song 2.
Yeah, that phrase is so evocative.
We aggressively resist the idea that nature is content with a little, because our entire modern economy, our culture, our media is built on the engine of convincing us we perpetually need more. We are socially conditioned to be terrified of what the text calls grim want.
We are fed with bounties, but our craving only grows frantic. To accept that losing things might actually be good for our souls goes against every marketing message we have ever absorbed since childhood.
That friction is why we must approach this text with a high degree of discernment. As profound as this wisdom is, we cannot just blindly swallow every ancient assumption. We have to distinguish the enduring, transformative truth from the limitations of the era in which it was written.
Right, because there are definitely parts that feel a bit disconnected from our reality.
Let's talk about those limitations, because in Song 5, the text leans heavily into this former age romanticism. It paints this highly idealized, almost utopian picture of a primitive past where people were too blessed.
Yeah, they slept on grass, they ate frugal acorns, they didn't mix wine with honey, they didn't have colorful silks, and they didn't sail ships for trade.
The heavy-handed implication is that human progress, agriculture, global trade, culinary arts, fashion is inherently corrupting. And I'll be honest, I'm not giving up my comfortable mattress and modern medicine to go sleep in a field and eat acorns to find spiritual peace.
Nor should you. That is a classic trope of ancient philosophy, the myth of the uncorrupted golden age. If we look at the deeper principle, we realize we don't need to literally regress to a pre-industrial, acorn-eating society to implement this wisdom. The enduring truth here isn't about rejecting human ingenuity, art, or physical comfort.
Right. The real warning is buried in the final lines of that song, where it laments the greed of getting glowing more fierce than Mount Etna's fiery blaze. It's a warning against the insatiable greed that often accompanies progress, not a condemnation of progress itself.
We can enjoy a brilliantly cooked meal, live in a beautiful home, or appreciate art without letting the wild lust of having become an erupting volcano that destroys our internal peace.
Exactly. There's a balance. And there is another, perhaps more critical area where we need modern psychological discernment, which is the text's reliance on harsh stoicism. Philosophy repeatedly refers to the author's grief, his very real tears over losing his entire life and facing execution, as a sickness.
She demands that he dry his tears and achieve perfect, unfeeling tranquility.
Through the lens of modern trauma psychology, that is actively harmful advice. We know today that repressing deep emotional pain isn't a sign of health, it's a recipe for psychological collapse.
It absolutely is.
If you lose your life's work, if you are separated from your family and facing a death sentence, crying is a deeply human, biologically appropriate, and healthy response to severe trauma.
It is entirely appropriate, and this is where we have to separate the philosophical framework from the ancient Stoic aesthetic. We can fully accept the author's philosophical conclusion that true, unshakable security must be built internally, and that external goods are fleeting, without adopting the ancient demand to surgically remove human emotion.
You can recognize the mechanics of the Wheel of Fortune. You can deliberately build your identity on the low rock, and you can still weep when the hurricane hits.
Experiencing grief and possessing philosophical resilience are not mutually exclusive. They are two sides of a healthy human experience.
That distinction is vital. We are using this ancient text to cultivate resilience, not to turn ourselves into sociopathic robots who don't feel pain. So, let's look at the landscape we've traversed. We've systematically dismantled the illusion of wealth as a hoarding mechanism. We've laughed at the absurdity of physical power using the mouse analogy.
We've shrunk the pursuit of fame down to a microscopic, temporary point in an infinite cosmos. We've talked about anchoring to the low rock and accepting the harsh, grappling iron honesty of ill fortune.
If all of the external pursuits are hollow, what is actually left to hold the human experience or even the universe together?
This brings us to the most stunning poetic conclusion of this section of the text. After meticulously tearing down every false idol of human ambition, the text pivots in Song 8 to look at the fundamental metaphysical force that governs the cosmos. It concludes that this force is love.
Love is Lord of all. It's such a beautiful, sweeping shift in tone from the clinical teardown we just went through.
It is the ultimate synthesis. The text asks us to look at the natural world. Why do the elements cooperate instead of warring into chaos? Why do the seasons follow each other in perfect order? What restrains the massive oceans from sweeping over the earth?
It answers that love is the chain that binds it all together. Love rules the sea, the earth, and the heavens. And it argues that if this sovereign love were to remit its care for even a moment, the entire fair fabric of the universe would tear itself apart in endless conflict.
What fascinates me is how this specific concept echoes across so many different wisdom traditions and scientific disciplines.
You see this in the Buddhist concept of metta, or loving kindness, which posits a fundamental harmonizing energy that binds all living things together.
You even see metaphorical echoes of it in modern physics, in the relentless search for a unifying force like gravity or the strong nuclear force that holds the chaotic, spinning elements of the universe in a delicate, life-sustaining balance.
The parallels are profound. Whether you're viewing it through a theological lens, a philosophical framework, or even a metaphorical scientific perspective, the text is arguing that beneath the erratic, terrifying, spinning chaos of the Wheel of Fortune, there is a deeper, stabilizing reality.
It is love that unites tribes by just treaty. It is love that sanctifies marriages with pure affection. It is love that dictates faithful laws to comrades and friends.
And the final beautiful instruction of the text is a call to internalize that cosmic order. If love rules the sky, we are only truly blessed if that same love is throned on high in our own hearts. That is the ultimate impenetrable defense against fortune.
You can lose your money, your titles can be stripped away, your fame can evaporate into time, but if you have aligned your internal architecture with the fundamental law of love, you remain structurally sound. You remain unshakable.
It perfectly replaces the anxiety of hoarding with the expansiveness of connection. You stop trying to control the wheel, and you start participating in the chain that holds the universe together.
It's just a brilliant framework for living.
It really is. So let's bring this all the way home for you, the listener. We started this deep dive by imagining the catastrophic, sudden loss of everything you hold dear. We've explored how philosophy diagnoses our desperate attachment to these external things as a sickness.
And we've seen how the loss of them, while agonizing, is often the only time the universe is truly honest with us, stripping away our counterfeit friends and our illusions of control.
But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. If the grappling iron of ill fortune is the only mechanism that reliably delivers this level of brutal, clarifying honesty, how can we actively invite that honesty into our lives without waiting for a catastrophe to strike?
That's a huge question.
Do you really have to wait for the stock market to crash or for a terrifying health crisis to figure out who your real friends are and what your low rock is? Can you voluntarily strip away the noise today?
Take a hard look at your life this week. Identify the superfluities, the accessories for protection that are quietly generating your anxiety, and experiment with letting them go.
Step off the wheel of fortune on your own terms, empty your pockets, and see what unshakable things remain. That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. See you in the next episode.